Hey everybody, and welcome back to Be Like Christ. We're starting kind of a new study today. We've finished the book of Genesis, and now we're moving on to the book of Exodus. We're trying to go through one chapter of the Bible every day until we're done, and we've been creating handouts and some resources for every chapter that we've talked about so far. We're also going to be creating a physical book, and hopefully you'll be able to get all those things on the website. All the digital files for those are available now. Currently working on editing the Genesis book, and I'm hoping by the time we get to the book of Leviticus, I'll have the book out actually before we do the study, Lord willing, hopefully. That way people can buy it ahead of time and then use it, because I know for me personally, I'd rather use a hard copy book than read something digitally online. But we're not quite there yet. Still got digital files available out on the website for this study, Exodus chapter 1. We've got a new handout, new things to look at, some new scenery. I'm excited about that. Got bored with the Genesis design after 50 chapters. So, all right, let's talk about this. When did the events of Exodus chapter 1 take place? Well, if we utilize the timeline that we use for the Genesis study, Jacob's family moved down to Egypt in approximately 1706 BC, and the Egyptians enslaved the Israelites sometime after Joseph's death in 1635 BC. We've got a whole new set of characters in Exodus, but we are going to reference back to a few familiar faces. The first characters we're going to mention are the 12 sons of Jacob. They are briefly mentioned at the beginning of Exodus because they were the fathers of the tribes that grew from their descendants. We're also going to talk a whole lot in Exodus about the Israelites, or the Hebrews. The term Israelite or Hebrew are used synonymously, and it refers to the nation of people that grew out of Jacob's 12 sons. And in Exodus, we're going to see them going from just 12 sons and their families to a large nation of people. And then we have Pharaoh. Remember, Pharaoh is not a specific guy, but a title of the king of Egypt. And the Pharaoh that we're going to talk about in Exodus, well, there's a couple of them, but they weren't great guys, and especially one of them who was murderous and genocidal, and he tried to stop the Israelite nation from growing. And then two women are our last characters here. They're only mentioned a couple times in the Bible. Their names were Shiphrah and Puah. They were midwives to the Hebrew women, right? So they helped them give birth. And they were very brave and courageous, and their bravery is commended because they defied Pharaoh's evil orders to kill all of the male newborn children of the Hebrews. Now, as we think about our map, where did these events take place? Well, it took place in Egypt, where Genesis left off. We know that the Israelites lived in the region of Goshen, but a specific city isn't mentioned here. And so now, as we do with every chapter, let's break the chapter down into sections, talk about the main themes that run through it. So for Exodus chapter 1, I've broken it down into 3 sections. The first one is verses 1 through 7. Israel's children multiply and grow into a large nation. The sons of Jacob, or Israel, remember he had his name changed by God, his sons that went down to Egypt with him were named Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, and Joseph. The text tells us that Joseph and all of his brothers died, but their children, quote, multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. So this first section just talks about how the population of the Israelites was exploding. That leads us into our second section, verses 8 through 14. Pharaoh tries to suppress the growth of the Israelite nation. A new Pharaoh ascended the throne of Egypt. And the text tells us that this Pharaoh didn't remember Joseph and all the things that him and his people had done for Egypt. He feared the growing strength of the Israelites, and he feared that they were actually going to become more powerful than the Egyptians. And if there was ever a rebellion in Egypt, or the enemies of Egypt ever came against them, that Israel might ally with the enemies and become quite a significant force. So Pharaoh forced Israel's children into slavery, and he put taskmasters over them and subjected them to hard labor. They built several cities for Pharaoh, including Pithom and Ramses. And the text says that Pharaoh, quote, made their lives bitter with hard labor in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. But even though Pharaoh was ruthless, the children of Jacob continued to multiply. Their growth couldn't be stopped. And so this led Pharaoh to do what he does in our next section, verses 15 through 22, a genocide of the Hebrew children. After realizing that his enforced slavery wasn't keeping the population down, Pharaoh went to the midwives who helped the Hebrew women give birth, and he told them that when a Hebrew woman gave birth to a son, the midwives were supposed to kill it. But to the credit of the midwives, they refused to obey this command. And when Pharaoh asked them why they weren't killing the male children, they told him that the Hebrew women were just too quick and they were giving birth before they could arrive, and therefore, they couldn't do their job. And we're told that God blessed the midwives for their rebellion against Pharaoh's command. After the midwives didn't work, the slavery didn't work, Pharaoh just made a general command that all newborn male children of the Hebrews were to be thrown into the Nile River and killed. So now, as we always do, let's finish off this study with an application. Today's application is going to be a little bit different. It's not one that you're going to necessarily be able to take and apply into your everyday life as you're running your errands or going to the grocery store or having coffee with somebody or something. But it's really designed to help us to see that the scriptures are historically accurate, that they are historically realistic. The reason for this is because there's a lot of people who attack this story and they say there's no way that Jacob's children could have grown into a large nation in such a short period of time. So in this application, we're going to ask, is that true, and can we trust the Bible as a historical source that's giving us credible information about the way that the Israelite nation grew? So let's crunch some numbers here, and if you are watching on YouTube, you're going to be able to see all of this information up on the screen. So I want to talk about how large a nation could potentially become in 7 generations, because that's roughly the amount of time I think that we're talking about with the Israelites growing and developing while they were in Egypt. So 7 generations, if you start off with 12 people, how large can a nation get through the multiplication of children upon children upon children through the generations? Now, I'll admit that these numbers don't take all the variables into account. They're not precise really in any way, but they do give us an idea of how big a nation might become. For the sake of the illustration, let's say that every one of the original 12 children of Jacob had 5 more children. That might sound like a really big family. It is in the modern day, but historically speaking, that really wasn't very big at all. And when you look at the genealogies that we've already talked about in the book of Genesis, you'll realize that 5 children was nothing. So let's say that we'll just say 5 children each, and those 5 children then went out and had 5 children. Also keep in mind that this was a nation of people that was being blessed by God to be very fruitful and to multiply, because God was keeping a promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and to make them into a great nation. So God's hand is behind all of this childbearing and child rearing and the growth of this nation. So there's the natural factor, but there's also a miraculous and providential factor to consider. So all that just to say, 5 children for each family, I think, is probably an underestimate, but we'll use it for this illustration. I'm not going to read all of these numbers, but when you start multiplying 5 children times 5 children times 5 children, you can go from 12, Jacob's 12 sons in the first generation, to almost 1 million people in the 7th generation. And certainly, historically speaking, that would have been a very large nation. So if we give 30 years to each generation, Jacob's 12 children could have produced nearly 1 million offspring in a roughly 200-year period of time. Now, obviously, some of those million people would have died from old age before they reached the 200-year mark, but just notice that the death rate certainly would not have been anywhere close to the birth rate and the multiplication rate. So again, we're talking about 7 generations, 200 years, nearly 1 million people, and that is almost certainly an underestimate. So just take that and see that those who criticize this story as being historically impossible, historically inaccurate, they actually really don't have a case to make here. So can we trust the Bible in Exodus chapter 1 and moving forward into the book of Exodus? Yes, we can. Thanks everybody for studying along with us today. As always, you can download the digital file that you saw up on the screen on our website, tobelikechrist.com. There's a link down in the description.